Welcome to Local Leverage, your competitive edge in business. Today we're joined by Jason Macht, a direct mail expert and founder of Whitespace Solutions, a firm dedicated to making direct mail smarter, faster, and far more effective for real estate professionals. In this episode, we tap into Jason's expertise to explore why direct mail has made a big comeback in 2025. We uncover the X factor behind high-performing campaigns and lay out a proven direct mail campaign roadmap. If you use direct mail in your business, this is your new playbook. Jason, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Yeah, I know you got a ton of experience in small business marketing, specifically around direct mail, and been an advocate for, crafting winning campaigns, everything from kind of the assembly of data through the execution of campaigns and measurement. And so I think that's going to be fantastic to talk about. My request for you is I want you to give some of the secret sauce to the audience today and kind of unpack how we really put together winning campaigns. Does that sound fair?
Sounds good. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, so let's just start at the top. I mean, specifically in real estate, it feels to me like direct mail is kind of having a renaissance. It kind of maybe felt old and stale for a little while, and now it's one of the things, or the thing, that I hear real estate professionals talking about over and over is they're using direct mail successfully. Why do you think it's having that renaissance?
Yeah, I think it's a factor of a number of things. Largely a lot of pressures, I think, in other channels, right? SMS has been having a lot of challenges with just the regulations and the rules that come out around it, have come out around it. And just like connectivity, being able to get, SMS through the carriers has become more difficult. Yeah. Used to be, probably people's number one channels. It was the only thing they're doing. I think the same is probably true for cold calling outbound. I mean, you have a lot of regulations around that you have to sort of watch out for, and same issue on sort of connectivity. A lot more headwinds there, and direct mail has sort of always been tried and true. I'm actually always amazed at how successful and productive it can be. I think the challenge there is it's it can be hard to sort of like execute. It's a lot of moving parts. It's a lot of data. That's sort of the challenge. But I think the benefit that direct mail often has is it's going to people's homes in their mailboxes. It's very sort of personal, whereas digital can be very sort of crowded, right? PPC is another big channel. Social is another avenue, SEO, but a lot of those get super crowded. Whereas direct mail, it's, people are always going to have homes, whether the latest AI thing is out there in the market or whatever it may be. People are still going to check their mailboxes, and I think that's why it's still productive, and that's kind of why it's going through this renaissance now. People, I think, are running into headwinds across these other channels, having a harder time finding like ROAS that makes sense, and getting leads at affordable rates. And so I think people are starting to revert back to direct mail in a lot of ways, and it's becoming a lot of people's main channel.
Yeah. One of the things I like to say is that there's no filter on the mailbox, right? I mean, whether it's regulatory or like a spam filter for email. I mean, there's all these things that are keeping you from connecting with your audience, and direct mail still feels like something that's it's going to get in their hands, and very likely it's going to get multiple impressions before it makes its way to the trash can.
I think that's right.
Yeah, cool. What do you see as kind of the big mistakes that folks make when they approach direct mail? One of the things that I get a kick out of, it's both funny and frustrating to me, is you get into a big group of real estate investors, real estate professionals, and everybody says, what piece is working? Or it seems like such a very broad and open question. But I'm curious, what are you seeing work, and what are you seeing as the big mistakes that folks make?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is sort of having a framework in place when you step into direct mail, and having sort of clear expectations. You mentioned people looking for the killer piece, right? They look for these like silver bullets, and there definitely are pieces that perform better than others, but that's sort of like only one piece to the puzzle. So I think, number one, when you're stepping into direct mail, you have to kind of view it as like a long-term play. It's not like fast leads. It's definitely not going to be easy. It's going to be sort of a long-term investment in terms of, how you're running the campaigns and kind of like how much you actually need to scale into it. It's definitely not for the faint of heart in that way. And especially if you're just starting out, there's probably other channels that might be like a little bit more, quicker to execute on and fulfill. Whereas direct mail, you kind of have to be committed and then kind of have a good plan on like what you're going after and really a good, as I said before, framework or like strategy in terms of how you think about all of the components around it. So it's not just the piece. It's in my mind a lot more about the data, your ability to execute, the cost inputs into it. And all of those need to add up in order to have like really productive, successful campaigns. I think the other thing I would add to that is probably just around knowing your numbers throughout the funnel, because, marketing and any of these channels aren't going to solve a bad sales funnel, right? If you're not actually able to convert these leads at a high rate and you're able to sort of prove out that ROAS, then it doesn't really matter how much money you spend on the mail or whatever the channel might be. Your problem's likely not a lead problem. It's probably like a sales conversion channel problem where you really need to sort of close that gap. So, I think number one is, having the right strategy. You got to have the right in terms of like content and context strategy and how to think about that. So when I think about content, it's like, okay, what is the one or two pieces? Usually I like to keep it really simple. I do have guys that are doing, many different pieces, A/B testing, but that's really hard to do unless you're at scale. And we can talk a little bit about statistical significance and A/B testing and like what's actually really required for that. But usually keeping it simple, having a strategy in mind. The key piece really around direct mail is the data. And I think that's often maybe overlooked or not well understood. And like that's really the crux of a success in my mind, is having good inputs to the data. I think there's a lot of sources that you can tap into for that, but you gotta at least be able to understand the segments, and it's all the main distresses that you would normally be thinking about, right? Pre-foreclosure, probates, absentees, right? Those are usually the biggest. And so you have to have a sort of a strategy around each of those, and then you need to sort of like execute these campaigns over several months to actually really observe true performance. And again, you need to get to these levels of like statistical significance to be able to get real reads on like what's converting well, what's not converting well, how is it going. And so that's kind of coming back to the long time horizon concept, is you got to really be able to tolerate that. You will see leads in the early days, but you got to be doing tens of thousands of pieces a month, I would argue, in order to really be productive.
Great. So I want to tap into a bunch of the things you just talked about, specifically data. But let me jump back to your kind of first comment around the commitment and kind of the duration, right, that you're going to commit to. There's like you said, I mean, I've seen plenty of situations where somebody does a kind of a one and done mailer, and they'll maybe look at it and maybe you have success with it. Maybe they get something out of it. But most often I get I tried direct mail, but it didn't work. When you think about commitment, what are you talking about? Set a frame for people. How long should they commit to, and what kind of cadence or frequency throughout that commitment is kind of like the ante to the game?
Yeah, I would say minimum probably 3 months, depending at the monthly volume. When we're talking about direct mail, you're looking at like conversion rates of like maybe 0.5% on like gross response. That's just like people picking up the phone, right? Usually I see anywhere between, probably on average around 50% of that will convert, like will actually be true net leads. That's like netting out all the miscellaneous calls and take me off the list type calls. So then at that point, like your net response rate is 25 basis points, a quarter of a percent, right? So, if you're sending, 10,000 pieces, like you're only having like a handful of actual like leads signal within that data to actually give you a really good indication. And in order to get a real read, especially when you're doing like things like split testing, And there's some really good like sample size calculators that you can go out there to like get an appreciation for this. But in the world of like let's say you're in a split test, 2 pieces, and your baseline conversion rate's like 0.5%, you're going to need something on the order of depending on how like the degree of confidence that you want to have that you're actually reading reliable signal in the data, it's going to be in excess of 50,000 pieces per creative, depending on like the confidence level and the magnitude of like the lift that you want to see. So I think the biggest challenge and the biggest mistake I often see is, people will do like one campaign. It might be like 5,000 pieces, and they're like, oh, that didn't work. And then they'll just like move on to some other piece because they want to see if that one's going to work better. So I think really just like defining the definition of success. And I think you need to run that campaign probably multiple months. I mean, if you're only doing like 10,000 pieces, at a minimum, you need to at least hit that threshold of a significant sample size, which in that example is like 50,000 pieces. That's 5 months. Now, if you're doing 50,000 a month, you might be able to get a read much faster, obviously, and then start to look at making some adjustments. I think the other piece there is, it's keeping things consistent and giving that time and duration in order to get a proper read. I think, and not changing things too quickly, right? I think the other piece is you have to really control for the variables, right? And so you really can't change too many things at once, because behind the scenes of like your mail campaign, maybe you're changing out the data sources, or maybe you're changing out the segments that you're actually targeting, or maybe you're changing out, or maybe you're not even tracking how many times you actually remailed that individual. And so you sort of need to be able to have this ability to track all of those parameters. And when you're trying to make a decision about like performance in the data, you have to essentially keep all those sort of controlled and fixed. And then you only change one variable at a time to actually get a real understanding of what's going on, and not make decisions based on some other variable that you weren't considering that actually is factoring in. A good example of that would be, if I'm going to do sort of like an absentee campaign, and I'm going to compare that to like, a owner-occupied high equity campaign. Well, those are two very different populations of people. And you can't run campaigns against those and compare the results and be able to make sort of like a decision about that. You need to have the population of the people consistent. And so in that example, if you're doing just absentee, it needs to be all absentee, and they need to be randomized kind of across that in order to compare differences, so that you have very similar groups of people that you're comparing when you're making a decision about it. So that's the biggest thing I think I would say from that is like, it needs to be at volume. You need to look at sort of minimum sample sizes to get an appreciation. And then you need to control all other variables and isolate the one thing that you're looking for. And typically, when it comes to creative, the one thing you're looking for is the creative. So all the other variables about the population need to be sort of fixed.
Yeah, I love that approach. I mean, you're taking a very scientific approach to this. And I think that's a trap that I see often, is that people start playing with multiple 3-4 variables at one time. And then how do you possibly compare against it? I also think you run the risk then of confusing the audience, right? You've not established some level of consistency, right, through which you're building trust. So to do that well, and I think you've got to have a lot of forethought when you're doing your creative, you're doing your list build, you're trying to identify up front, what are the variables I'm now going to change up over the course of this campaign. It seems like that needs to be considered before you send piece number one. Is that how you look at it?
Yeah, so I think you have to start on a good foundation, right? And that's where, again, I kind of default back to like the framework, right?
Yeah.
Do your homework. Try to understand, what pieces are performing for other people out there in the market. Even on that note, I would argue that just because it's working in one market and for one operator doesn't mean it's going to work for you. Markets Absolutely. Are very different. People in those markets are very different. So you do really need to have this sort of like mentality of testing. But you need to sort of put your best foot forward and sort of like map out the strategy that you think is going to have the most success. and then just ride that out until you actually have sample to make adjustments. And then the really hard thing, I think, is being sort of disciplined and not changing things too quickly.
Right.
And I think as business owners and operators, that's the hardest part, right? Because you're moving fast and you're trying to, drive revenue and drive leads and keep the sales team fed and all of those components. But you sort of need to be disciplined in terms of how you execute that, not sort of shoot from the hip and make changes too quickly, because you may find yourself in a hole that you can't get out of to like recover from, and you kind of just land on like, oh, that doesn't work for me. Well, I would argue that you probably introduced too many variables where you weren't able to actually make an informed decision on whether it was working or not. So I think that's the biggest piece in terms of mapping it out, setting, again, the framework and foundation. Okay, here are the 3 or 4 lists we're going to go after. Here's how aggressive we're going to get, as maybe like a framework that I would share of how I think about it. Usually like the higher motivation, and usually motivation and distress tends to correlate with response rates, right? And so pre-foreclosure, probate, there's real distress there and real reasons why someone would have to sell in those examples. And so you can get more aggressive. So in those, you might do, as frequently as weekly or monthly. And then the sort of less, pointy distresses, like just being absentee or absentee out of state, there's correlation there, but there's not as any real pressure there typically. And so you're going to have to elongate your cadence, because you're trying to essentially control for cost relative to the probability that they're going to actually respond. And so those are going to be, maybe every 3 months, every 4 months. So once you kind of like align that sort of strategy, then it's like, okay, what are the pieces? Generally, how I think about content and contact strategy is, really you're trying to think about, like what is the offer? Like what are you putting out there to them that's going to be any different than anybody else out there? Which is always hard to differentiate. I think you'll see in the space that people sort of convene towards like 1 or 2 things that sort of work, and then everybody does it. So then it's really hard to differentiate. So you have to like introduce your new ideas around that you think could be better. In the context of, fix and flip and wholesale, a lot of times it's around the offer price, right? And so that's like one data input that you then have to inspect very deeply in terms of like what's going to drive sort of the most response. I think the other sort of narrative to that is around sort of just the communication strategy, like the hook points that you include in yours. And so if you think about mail as more of a journey and multiple pieces that you're going to put in front of somebody, each piece in my mind should sort of build on the other. Whereas a lot of times what I'll see people do is just the same piece over and over and over again. And I think that's kind of what, is the fastest path to throwing it away, because it becomes, people start to tune it out. So if you can introduce new creatives, new formats that sort of build on top of each other, the entire strategy is like, trying to be there at the right time. And that's the part of staying consistent. A lot of it's a timing game. And then the other piece is, ideally you're creating some sort of emotional hook points or trust through your communications where, you're going to be the first person that an individual calls because, they saw your piece, you're kind of in their minds, and, they feel good about your brand and your company, and they trust that you'll sort of do right by them. And so I think those components combined are really important.
Yes, you just dropped a whole bunch of knowledge bombs there. That's great. I mean, so I think you and I are very similarly minded on this, really approaching this thoughtfully with a lot of planning up front. So we're about to approach a campaign we were just working on a little bit yesterday, and I'm kind of taking a page from kind of our digital book, but looking at this is like establishing our campaign, the number of touches, the audience, the messaging, the variables that we intend to modify as we go, and maybe I'm overthinking this, but I think the way that we were looking at this is building almost a hypothesis up front to say, this is the audience, this is the sequencing of messaging over this number of touches and duration, and these are the items that we intend to swap out as variables along the way. Or to your point, these are the things that we want to build upon in kind of a story sequence versus just sending the same piece. Is that how you approach it, or is that overkill?
I think there's a balance. I think in some ways, yes. At the same time, you need to keep it simple because there are a lot of moving parts and you don't want to overcomplicate the campaigns. But that said, I do agree with this like idea of creating this like narrative or story and sort of like really focusing pieces of content around sort of like one idea, where a lot of times what I see is people will try to do everything in a given piece. Like there's like an offer amount, and it's like, look at us on Google, and it's like call or text us or scan this QR code, and by the way, we do all these other things, and they'll have like 10 bullet points, right? I think that's where it starts to become, you tune that out, and it's maybe too noisy, too busy. And so like when I think about it, yes, I like this idea of a journey. Each piece should be like really focused. Here's the value prop. Here's the one call to action. And you really got to keep it focused. And then the next piece, you try something different. Okay, now the next one's going to be more anchored around social proof. And here's all our great testimonials and our Google star rating. And, here's the one call to action. And I think you can have multiple calls to action. I often get asked about like, oh, should I use this QR code in this piece, that kind of thing. Yeah, yes, maybe, or you just try that in a different piece, or you split test that, but you really need to sort of isolate it. And the question is like, where do you ultimately like want to drive people? Are you driving them to your phones to call in? Are you driving them to text you in your team? Are you driving them to a website in a web form? I think all of those can be successful, but definitely not done all at the same time. And I think you afford yourself that opportunity when you have this expectation that you're going to do this and remail people over time. You can start to like iterate on those. And I think the benefit to that is people will have different ways that they want to interact. And some people might prefer the text. Some people might prefer going to the website. And so by sort of introducing those strategies in isolation over time, you are able to sort of cover a broader spectrum of the population that will increase your probability that like one of those people will convert through one of those channels, through one of those calls to action or the messaging and the hooks that you're trying to test. So I think the answer is somewhere in between. I like that idea. Keep it simple, keep it focused, and map it out, with that in mind.
Yeah, that's great. We're in a really interesting situation in that because we not only are a data source but also a targeted outbound lead generation platform. We get to see thousands of people's campaigns, right? So you get to see what people are doing. And I feel like, and this is just very anecdotal, but as I scan through these, every night I get all of the orders coming through our system, and I just kind of geek out on them. But I'll see one of two things. I see people that have kind of this muddled call to actions where they've got maybe 3 calls to action on a single campaign piece, or honestly, I see some that have no call to action. Do you have a framework of kind of what's the right way to go about that? I mean, I obviously there's a cleanliness of having a single call to action, but I agree that people are going to respond to different things and they have their own way of reaching out when they're interested. But how do you find that balance? What's your recommendation for number of call to actions or the type of call to action?
Yeah, I actually think about it a lot like a website page, like a funnel page, where you have like your headline, and then you have like a hook or something like a sub headline, something that's going to like draw them in and like get them engaged. And then, you have like sort of the body of it, whatever like the offer is or the value prop, right? And then you have ideally one call to action, at most 2. And I would consider like, call us, text us, that's 2. Ideally, you're saying, just call us. And that's what I see, across most people. I actually came from a fintech space where we did direct mail to basically sling credit cards across the US. And we were entirely digital, right? So our only call to action was like, hey, go to this website. Or in that case, we actually did use a QR code to enter your information. And so like that's its own sort of, journey and call to action. And then so generally you have the primary call to action and then you reinforce the call to action. So you might have it in the main body then it should be down again at the very end, because as they, if someone's just scanning through something, you want the main thing to stand out at the end of it, and they're like, okay, I'll call them, and they might even not even read the whole thing, but like phone number's right there, okay, we'll call. And so any way you can sort of emphasize those things, we use some tricks where you maybe use like a handwritten kind of like image. It looks like a circle where you're like just drawing attention, or just reinforcing it. You can reinforce it through like bolding it or making it a larger font, things like that, right? But I think one call to action, ideally, reiterated multiple times, 2, maybe 3 times, and then definitely have it in the middle and then at the bottom where someone will see it. Last thing they kind of look at when they're scanning through.
Yeah, right where their eyes leave the page, right? Last thing. Yeah, cool. All right, let's make the jump over to data, because I know you mentioned this earlier, and I know this is kind of where it all starts, and I believe this is where it all starts as well. How do you recommend the folks that you work with assemble their audience?
So the biggest challenge I often see is people pull lists from multiple different sources, and this is maybe like a hot take. There's this idea of like list stacking, right? Where people sort of like amalgamate like multiple lists, and then they like go through this like a whole deduplication exercise. And a lot of times they're just running this out of like spreadsheets, which very quickly just gets like very difficult to manage. And so like the real solution in my mind to this is like having a proper database. The list stack in my mind is like literally just fields and flags. And then, a proper database with an identifier allows you to essentially, that is your deduplication, right? You just merge records into the same identifier, and you can enrich the data by having the sort of like the right data structure.
And when you talk about list stacking, just so the audience understands, like you have discrete lists. Maybe one is a non-owner occupied property, and the other list is a pre-foreclosure, and you're trying to mesh those two together, right? To identify maybe multiple levels of distress for the sake of building an audience. Is that how you see list stacking?
That's right. Yeah. Usually what ends up happening is people are trying to like aggregate multiple disparate sources, right? So maybe you're getting like probate records from the county, and then you're just doing property search records to find like absentee, and then maybe you're looking for like your county like tax lien records, and so you have like these disparate sources that you're trying to get them from. People like pull them from all these places, and then they go through this whole like exercise in Excel where they're trying to like make out and make sense of the data, which I think it becomes overwhelming and is like very error prone. And so I think when I think about data, the key things is, in my mind, direct mail is really a data play in terms of like what you have to get really right. And so having the right data sources, and not to plug PropertyRadar, but like that's why I was sort of drawn there, because there's like 2 problems that I think it in that example solves for me really well. It essentially is that database in a way. You guys have sort of like unique identifiers, and it becomes easy to work with the data because it's sort of API driven. And so I think like once you have those 2 pieces right, you can still enrich that data with other sources, but by making it easy to sort of move around through an API, it gets you out of the Excel spreadsheet, and then you sort of already have the majority of like the list stacks, like the multiple flags or indicators that you might leverage to, at the end of the day, segment the data, right? You're trying to find people with like multiple flags that are list stacked, quote unquote. You would correlate to, I have a higher probability to getting a response from those guys. And so that starts to drive sort of your strategy. But if you're able to abstract this sort of like operational overhead of, aggregating all this data, deduping it all, cleansing the data, layering in hygiene, and then trying to figure out then how am I going to go fulfill that file of mail. And then I think more importantly, the other part of this like data problem that has to be solved is like the tracking and reporting of it, right? Yeah. So that might work the very first time you go through that exercise, but like the 100th time you go through that exercise, like how do you then wrap your arms around everything you did in the past? And I think that's where people get lost over time, and as they start to scale, is they now have like a Google Drive of all these files of all the things they've done in the past, but they don't They don't have an appreciation of like, oh, wait, how many times did I actually mail that person in that file? What did that look like over time? How did that, how did people respond like by the third time I touched them with a piece of mail? And then how do I actually control my future mailings relative to like the number of times I touch that person, right? As one example of like the degree of complexity this can kind of get to. And so I think the best approach to that is having a database, right? Like a real database, like a Postgres or BigQuery, some of the tools out there that maybe people aren't familiar with. They're actually not that difficult to work with. But you need to have that level of tracking and add these other fields around times mailed and piece put in front of them and all these things so you can actually do the analysis that you need at the end to sort of close the feedback loop of, okay, you spent a bunch of money on mail, it went out, you got X number of leads. How do I then track that over time to then iterate on the strategy and refine and then isolate the pockets that are low performing? And that could be a multitude of dimensions. It could be particular zip codes. It could be particular distress point segments. It could be a cut point after the number of times you mailed them. And you see like in the data that by the sixth touch, nobody's responding, as an example. So all of those pieces are sort of all the things that you need to put together, I think, to have a really successful direct mail program over time and afford you the opportunity to really scale into it. And lean into it and have success there over time and, move past, maybe a couple of lucky campaigns where you had like a 10x ROAS at scale when you're doing like 100,000 pieces a month and you're trying to maintain, 4x ROAS. Those are the pieces and the inputs that you need, I think, in order to make that possible.
Yeah, absolutely. Just since you're on ROAS there, do you have a specific ROAS target? And return on ad spend is ROAS for those that don't know.
Yes. I actually have a couple thoughts on this topic as well. With ROAS, like obviously that's a metric that you care about at the end of the day as the business owner. In terms of targets, it's really hard to say in terms of what any one individual or any individual team will get. And the reason I say that is because ROAS is actually not just a function of the marketing, right? The mail piece isn't going to bring dollars in the door like the sales team is going to do that.
Right.
So I think it's like it's like a sort of a trailing indicator, and it's sort of an incomplete indicator of the marketing channel itself. So I think it's definitely something you need to track and look at. In terms of like ROAS that I see, I mean, I have guys that I work with that are doing like 10x ROAS, and we're doing like 30 or 40,000 pieces a month. But I know I can't take credit for that, because if you look at their entire funnel and KPIs, like their average deal spreads, north of 50K a deal, and their sales team crushes it, and they're like net contract to like their contract to like net lead rate is in the double digits, right? And so those are metrics in other parts of the funnel that actually lead to the revenue. From the mail side, what you really need to, or any of the marketing channel core KPIs that you need to control for is really cost per net lead, right? How much am I spending to get that lead in? And that is really the parameter of success. If I'm spending $1,000 a lead to get them in the door, that's not great. If I can control that down to, a couple $100, then it's like, okay, I'm doing my job. The rest of the job and getting the revenue and driving that ROAS number is going to be really around the productivity of the sales team. At the end of the day, the average contract value, right? If your average contract value, or even if we abstract this from real estate, like if the average, think about like a home services business, maybe if you're talking about like the average value of a job that you're going to do, if it's a couple $1,000, it's going to be really hard to be successful if you don't have really high response rates to offset that. Same goes, true in the real estate space. If the average contract value is $10,000, well, the guy that they're competing against that has maybe more exit strategies or is doing fix and flip, and their revenue per contract is much higher, they're going to be able to outspend you. And so then it's really hard to sort of compete for that, with that. So to like distill that down, yeah, ROAS, I think at a base minimum, like you need to be at 3x or better. And that's sort of just like an industry thing I've seen. Why is it 3x? And is it 3x for everybody? I would say no. 3x is sort of just like a rule of thumb. It's kind of like the 1% rule in real estate when you're looking at like a rental property and if it'll cash flow. But if you actually like double click on that and if you actually have done deals, like you'll notice that like, okay, that rule of thumb doesn't necessarily apply across the board. It's really dependent on where interest rates are. It really depends on like quality of the asset and whether or not it'll cash flow. And actually like in my market, it's actually more like 2 or 3%, right? So I would say the 3x is kind of a rule of thumb. The idea there is with 3x, it's going to cover your marketing, right? Which is going to be roughly a third of that. And then you have like another 2/3 of that are going to cover like OpEx and headcounts. And then ideally you have some profit margin baked in there. But for some businesses, maybe that floor is going to be 4x for you to have like a profitable business. So I think generally that's where I see like the floor to be. If you're less than that, then you need to change some things. And it's either you need to change your cost structure in the marketing, or you need to change your throughput on the sales team, or you need to change your business model in terms of like the revenue you're actually able to drive per each of those leads. And then the guys that are doing, 10x and better, it just affords them more opportunity to like double down on the channel.
Sure.
And I think the real question becomes like, okay, what is the real margin the business is after, and like gross margin on revenue, and either they can double down, and then that essentially affords them the opportunity to go into maybe lower probability lists, lower responding lists. They'll compress their ROAS, but as a result, they'll be able to drive revenue that way. And so that's usually like the formula to how you scale in any of these marketing channels is sort of like playing with the levers in that. If the funnel is healthy and the cash flow and the contract values are healthy, you can then reach into other channels, compress the ROAS, but still drive like a healthy profit margin. And normally I see that sort of normalize down to like that 4 or 5x at scale.
That's all super helpful. And I think that, if folks didn't tease out the subtle piece in there, which is, outside of everything you just explained around ROAS, there's a critical component of making sure that you understand all of the different steps and stages within that funnel, right? And measuring each of those points, not just the end point of ROAS, but everything from the early response rates, and then of course it trickles down through your sales engagement or other kind of life cycle touch points. But having measurements at each stage, you kind of lightly touched on, but I think is really critical.
Yeah, and one thing I would highlight that like a way that I like to look at it that I don't actually see a lot of people look at it this way. So I mean, if you take that funnel and you just sort of like baseline it across the board, the easiest way for me to look at it is like you just sort of look at everything in the context of like a net lead, right? And so once you answer the question of like, okay, how is marketing doing in terms of the cost to bring that net lead in? And if you back out your average revenue back through the funnel to that sort of net lead, what is the net lead value from a revenue perspective on average? Yep. And then that's your ratio of essentially ROAS that you're trying to optimize for. And if you're spending $250 on that lead, you need to be average net lead value of at least $1,000 to hit a 4x ROAS, as an example. Right. And so that's like a really easy way in my mind to sort of just like simplify all these moving KPIs throughout the funnel and just sort of normalize it, because that sets the foundation of, how much can you afford to pay, and then how much revenue are you bringing in, and then that starts to answer the questions of like, where do I need to optimize? And then,
I like that too, because it seems like that's it's faster to get that information, right? I'm not going to wait for the entire cycle before I can then determine, and it feels very actionable. So I like that recommendation. I think that's really smart.
Yeah.
Tell me a bit about your philosophy on building your audience or building your list. Are you one that believes in kind of casting a broad net, or are you a hyper niche kind of a audience builder?
In terms of targeting and lists, I think starting out, you're best served to start really targeted and sort of focused in terms of like who you're going after. So if I was to look at a couple like use cases of that, I've mentioned like the niche list multiple times, right? Probate, pre-foreclosure.
Yeah.
Those are gonna be like really small lists in most markets. Same would be true for like, I don't know, if I'm thinking about like a realtor, like a home services business. You're gonna target like zip codes, right? Like how do I get really hyper focused on the areas that I think are gonna be the most productive, because that's gonna set you up for like a higher likelihood of success. And then I think through that, you start to like, figure out the process and what's working, what's not working. And then as you start to scale, then you sort of, in order to scale, you have to cast a wider net. So then the question is really, how do I do it efficiently? And
Right.
and then you have to solve a bunch of different problems in order to scale and cast that wider net. Otherwise, if you do that out of the gates, you can get hurt. Meaning, like you can have campaigns that kind of just blank or didn't get you the results that you're expecting, and you just burned $20K on a campaign that didn't yield anything. And I think that's likely mostly the fear of most people. And so, yeah, what I would say is, if you're in the early stages of solving for it, then it's like, yeah, start super targeted, build from there, and sort of like force rank like the order of operation of where you're going to start, and then work your way down the list, and then do it in a very sort of controlled manner. When you step into like it could be a new market, it could be a new list, like a new segment of like distresses or whatever that might be. And you have to kind of go through it in a very sort of controlled manner of what you're looking for, what your expectations are, and then testing into that. And I think the example of like testing a new market's a perfect example of that. It's because there's just a lot of unknown unknowns. You just don't really know and so you have to kind of like put the best possible strategy out, start relatively small, and then like scale from there.
I think you and I share that same philosophy, and I think to me, it's not just about getting a very targeted list for the sake of identifying people with the highest propensity, but it also then allows you to approach that audience with a far more specific message and with more empathy, because you're understanding exactly what they're facing, and potentially even the timing of that. So I think my belief is that by kind of going hyper targeted or tight niche, it then improves your opportunity for being really on point with your messaging and really understanding your market.
Yeah, and I think there's like second order effects of that as well, right? So there's like the targeting and just like getting the lead in the door component of it, but then there's also like the sales process and team behind that, right?
Right.
And so if the team behind it is not set up or prepared to have those conversations, that's also going to lead to challenges, right? And so I think by starting focused and having sort of a clear idea throughout the funnel of what that's going to look like, and making sure you're targeting people and you have the messaging to those people that your sales team is prepared to actually like talk to, whether like, pre-foreclosure is a good example. Like if you don't know anything about pre-foreclosure and how to navigate that process and actually help somebody through that,
Right.
then that's going to be a real challenge. Or, if you're doing a lot of like offer letters or check letters, that kind of thing, and a lot of the marketing is anchored around price, but you don't have a sales team that can speak to price and talk people, in and around price and like navigate the negotiation, you're going to have some challenges. And so,
Yeah.
you got to really look at it, sort of full funnel, and have a game plan and the team in place that can speak to those things and handle it and has experience. And then you sort of build on that over time in order to grow and scale.
Yeah, this may be a kind of a hot take on my side, but I think this concept of list stacking
Yeah.
has inherent problems in this regard, right? I mean, if I'm list stacking to identify people that have 3 or 4 sources of distress, and now I'm just casting a message out that is trying to tackle too much, versus like, let me mailbox stack instead of list stack. And in the mailbox, let me get really hyper specific. Let me talk to the challenges that a divorced couple are going through in terms of how they're going to dispose of this asset and how they're going to split this thing, right? Let me talk specifically about the person that is facing an HOA lien or whatever those things are. and then let my pieces, let my touches surface because they're super on point, and I've hit
Hmm.
the specific message topic versus trying to amalgamate it all together on the list and then cast more of a generic message to them. This is my
Yeah,
thought. I'm curious what you think
I
about that.
no, I tend to agree with this, and I think people are sort of seduced by this idea of list stack as if it's going to be this like silver bullet to I'm going to get much more cheaper leads. Actually, what I see in the data is that generally response correlates with the primary distress. Like, what is the main problem that the person's facing, and like what is the problem they're trying to solve? They're and in most cases they're not trying to solve. Like they might have three different problems. So they might be on that, as in your example, the HOA lien and like delinquent taxes, but I'm also going through divorce. Like
Right.
divorce is going to be the problem, right? Like
Right.
the other two
Well,
doesn't really matter. And so I think, yeah, if you just focus on the main problem and solving that problem, I think that's what a lot of that's
yeah.
what business is about, right?
And it's not even, I love what you're saying, and it's not even the surface problem, right? It's not the fact that I'm in foreclosure. It's the fact
Hmm.
that I've got to go tell my wife and kids that, hey, we're going to have to move. I've got to deal with the fact
Hmm.
I might have to put my kid into a different school system. I might have to face my neighbors and have that embarrassment of kind of leaving the house and leaving the neighborhood, right? So to me, it's like go that next level, right? Let's get down to what really is the issue. And so as a service provider, it's not just that I can pay cash and do a quick transaction. It's that maybe I can help you navigate this. I can find you another home through my network for you to rent, even though your credit's all screwy. Like those
Hmm.
those other things to me are the real problem. And but oftentimes I see people approach it just at the surface level, like I'm gonna, you know, go head on with you're facing an HOA lien or you're in foreclosure or whatever the issue might be, instead of really getting down to the emotional component of what the person's grappling with.
Hmm. Yeah, definitely agree with that.
Yeah. Um, okay, one last thing that I really want to tap into. We've talked a lot about direct mail and talked about lists. Love to hear your perspectives on kind of multi-channel approach versus a single channel. How you do that, how you make the decision of which channels to utilize, and also
Hmm.
just kind of what you see in terms of increased response rates as a result of doing multi-channel versus a single channel.
Yeah, so I think this is I don't know if I'd call it my favorite topic, but I like this solving this problem is, I think, something that like a lot of people have a really hard time with, and this is ultimately like what I try to like help people solve for. But in order to solve this sort of like omni-channel, like multi-channel problem, you need sort of like the tech in place to do that.
Mm-hmm.
The two big things, like the two big pieces of, as I would describe the tech stack, there's this idea of like a customer data platform. And what that helps do is sort of centralize your lists, the prospects that you're targeting, as well as like CRM data, and sort of like bring that into one place. And the second component of that is sort of like a marketing automation platform. And so with those tools, what you can do is then leverage the CDP, customer data platform, to do different variations of segmentation, right? And so that helps you with things like, layering in all of the segments that you would care about, right? Pre-foreclosure, probate, absentee, all these different things that you might have like aggregated over time. You can then layer on other sort of like segmentation strategies on top of that using these platforms like, hot zip codes, right? You can, or even just suppressing zip codes that you don't like. You can then layer on other tactics using these sort of like segmentation and filtering tools to cut out things like times mailed, or just suppressing respondents, or all these different components of like where you need to sort of like optimize sort of the list strategy. And then with the marketing automation component, that's where you can then sort of start to target through multiple channels. And so I use these tools to sort of like automate the direct mail side and enter people into segments and sequences that will touch them on sort of autopilot over time. But they also have other capabilities, and like the really impactful ones in my experience are to the extent you have, if you're enriching things like phone and email, you can leverage email as a channel to new prospects. I think even more importantly on the lead side, the nurturing side, once that mail piece has maybe converted, they're in the CRM, you bring your CRM data into this like central hub, this customer data platform, and then you can use these tools to put them in sort of multi-touch sequences, where in that case, you actually probably know if it was PBC or it came through an online form, you probably know what the email is. Most cases, you have the phone number, you already have the address. And so I'm having some clients that have a lot of success with building out really robust retargeting campaigns, especially through sort of these omni-channel constructs where they'll hit them with the piece of mail. They'll email them if they have email on file. They'll send a text that's already been validated and they have all the compliance checks on. And you can orchestrate that in sort of like a workflow builder-like campaign where it's like, okay, on this day, I'm going to hit them with this piece, hit them with this other channel with this other piece, and then text them, and then also push a task to my CRM to do an outbound dial. Right. So what the sort of end result of that can be and is you have this like really nicely orchestrated layer of outreach when, again, a big component of this entire game in business is just timing and also reaching out to somebody through the channel that they're going to respond to best. And to the extent you can introduce lower cost channels that aren't always just your team calling people and doing like a heavy lift on the outbound side, you can do things like email or retargeting through direct mail, or the one that I actually left out was retargeting in digital channels. And so once you have all the data in one place, you can create audiences that you can then push to digital channels. And you can actually retarget people on Facebook. You can retarget people on AdWords. And that becomes really powerful because they got the piece of mail or whatever it might be. They happen to go online and they get hit with the same, your branding and they call to action and offer. And I've seen a lot of cases where people get hit multiple times, end up calling in, that becomes the deal. Yeah. And so that is, I think, expert level of operators that are thinking at that kind of level in terms of like the nuance and detail of how they think about targeting and doing sort of this omni-channel approach. And I think to be successful there, you need good data, whether it's CRM data or prospect data, and then you need sort of this like technical layer, the customer data platform in marketing automation to be able to execute that on that at scale. Yeah.
At the risk of, I don't want to make this promotional about us, but one of the things that we recently did was rolled out a offering called online ads, and essentially, as you're building your prospect list or your audience, we were able to identify all of the device IDs and associations to those individuals and do the same thing you would do with retargeting, but we can do it proactively and put your ad wherever they are online or in mobile apps and push that.
That's great.
Just to that unique audience only, right? So we're doing that actually in advance of direct mail in many cases as a way to start greasing the skids and building trust so that when your direct mail piece lands, they've already had multiple impressions that tie to that piece. So there's some really cool things that can be done there. I love that you're thinking about it that way. I'm curious, when you think about these multiple channels and you're thinking about your audience, how are you making the decisions about which channels to use as you're architecting this kind of multi-channel, omni-channel approach? How are you making decisions about which of those to use for a given audience in a given campaign?
Yeah, I mean, I think it always kind of comes down to sort of like cost and where you have like the highest like likelihood of success. And so if I think now deeper funnel, and if we're just talking about, for example, lead nurturing, once the person's maybe shown interest and you at least have a lead sort of like in the CRM, you then have your own sort of funnel within that, right? It's typically, no contact or, haven't been able to get a hold of. And then it's, long-term follow-up lead nurture. That's like all your cold leads. And then it's like warm. And then it's like, okay, I had an appointment, but then they ghosted. And then it's maybe, okay, we actually put an offer in front of them, but they never signed. or maybe it's got under contract, but then they ghosted, right? So you have these like deeper stage sort of funnels. And I think for each of those, if you think about your normal like pipeline view, if you think about each of those sort of swim lanes, those vertical, statuses within your CRM, that becomes sort of the strategy. You have like a strategy for each one of those. And for the guys that you probably went on an appointment with, or maybe got an offer from in front of, but they never signed, you go a little bit more aggressive with them, and you can do mail, like is going to be your probably most costly channel typically, where you can actually put a mail campaign in front of them, and to the extent you have email, that's cheap, and you should just do that anyways because you have it available. Yeah. And then outside of that, you can text those people because you often have all the compliance checks. And so I think you think about the complexity and the frequency and the investment in the medium in that context of probability relative to that pipeline. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you might have like all the no context. Maybe you mail them once a quarter as a long-term follow-up. Obviously there was interest, but maybe the timing wasn't right. And so then it just becomes like kind of a timing play. And then you're probably going to put them in a, call queue, but like maybe that's, once every 6 months or once a quarter or once a month. Maybe you're not calling them every day because you need to adjust like the time investment and the actual like hard costs, the cost of the mail or any of the other mediums sort of in that context. And then I think the last piece would be, the retargeting side through digital. Those should just become audiences, and that's relatively lower cost typically from a retargeting perspective. So I think about it kind of in that context. I think the aggressiveness of the contact strategy kind of aligns with how deep into the funnel they are. And then, at the end of the day, and I think this is probably an underappreciated part, people love fresh new leads, but there's a whole other process around extracting value of your CRM and the leads that you already spent money to get into the CRM. There needs to be a ton of thought there, and you really do need sort of deeper funnel strategies. And I think mail should be a part of that strategy also, which I often don't see. And so I start to help people, solve that problem, close that gap. But I think the context there that I would highlight is, if they responded to you through mail, but then you sort of lost them on the phones, a lot of times like people are sort of like, have their own sort of channel that they like to communicate with. And if you're going to sort of like retarget them through email or retarget them through digital, or just keep trying to call them, well, your other channel that they did respond to was mail. Right. And so you should be following up through that channel as well and try to get them back in. And so I think that's just like an important part of the equation.
Yeah, I love that. Jason, thank you for bringing the sauce. This was great. I think people probably took a ton of value from this conversation, and it also makes me feel like we should do another because I think we could keep going for quite a while.
You got it.
In the meantime, how can people follow you and get connected with you?
Yeah, you can email me. My name's it's just my name, Jason at whitespacesolutions.ai. I've fallen off the posting train, but I tend to post a lot about AI and some of the things that I'm leveraging in that space and how I think it can be applied to businesses. And you can find me just JM Shu, or just search my name on Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube. I have some content up there as well.
Fantastic. Well, if you found value in this conversation, make sure you hit subscribe or pass this along to a friend or colleague that can also get some value. And again, Jason, thank you for joining us on Local Leverage.
Thanks for having me. It's been great.